my professors like what development or use, and he's like Ruby on Rails and HTML. So I was like, well, what's the difference?
Sure. There's no difference. I mean, to an end user with a browser open, it's just a big blob of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The question is, how does that get prepared on the server and then ultimately delivered to the end user? So, and there's all you have to do is look at poorly created sites with those frameworks. Like Rails is a really amazing framework, but it's very easy to abuse it because you can do so much damage so quickly with bloated markup and all this extra stuff that you don't actually need. So that's one of the reasons I like Rails so much, is that it doesn't do a whole lot of assuming about your templates or your HTML or anything, but it gives you this huge toolbox to construct stuff so that you're looking at just individual lines of code and being able to build things quickly. Like even if you look at the Basecamp, I'm signed in here. Yeah, I'm not. They've got that disabled. But right, like Basecamp, they're the outfit that created Rails to begin with, right? So whatever they're doing, it's usually a pretty good indicator of what the state of the art is. But oh, it's asking me to verify pillars or columns. This is actually kind of interesting. So if we go to like Basecamp 3.
So I basically got inside the building, walked into one room, something scared me.
Like, we've got some security things, but all the JavaScript, if we can find it. Yeah, this is not as pretty as it used to look, but they're still being fairly parsimonious with their assets. And here by line 71, we're closing out the head, and we're diving into the body. Whereas if we looked at Drupal or WordPress or something, like you can have head areas that stress, hundreds of lines and do dozens of CSS calls and things like that. And of course, over HTTP 1.1, every single CSS call is another piece of lag on your site, right? Because you've got to go out and open up a new request, have the request served, get it transferred back. So if you can do things like what Rails does with the asset pipeline, that packages all of that stuff up. Looks like they've got a couple of separate style sheets now, but.
Because when I was doing Android development, I noticed that it started, I don't know if it's always been that way, but it started using like XML and like HTML like tags.
Yeah.
So I was like, that's kind of interesting.
Right. Yeah. And it usually, when you see that, they're relying on some kind of JavaScript on the page to do the manipulation into HTML, which, of course, if you don't have JavaScript active, you're sunk. Right. So, all right.
Thanks, Professor.
You're welcome. How's everybody doing? It is a lightweight group in here today. Attrition. Okay, so today I want to talk about form elements and styling them, and we're going to strip it back. I've been kind of doing this huge, like, oh, what about this element, this element? We're going to look at just one element and one submit button, and we're going to kind of walk through styling those elements and then doing things like we did last semester, where we have a baseline grid and we have typographic scales, and sort of applying all that stuff and seeing how we can make that work with form elements. We'll look at the form portion of Normalize.css. I don't know if you remember last semester, I had at least a good 10-minute excursus about how I prefer resets to normalization, but when it comes to form controls, there are good arguments to be made for normalizing some of those things across browsers, so we'll look at that. We'll study that little bit of CSS. I don't know if I'll reference this usability article. I more stuck it up there for your own reference as you're working on Project 1. It is an official reading a few weeks from now on the calendar, but if you're interested in a quick reference on accessibility about form elements, that would be a good one to consult. And then we'll talk a little bit about form elements with responsive layouts, and we're going to do some stuff with JavaScript and pattern matching and a whole bunch of stuff, but we'll kind of just focus on one little tiny piece of form today. And we'll look at some ways to enhance this form with some other HTML structure that gives us some little bonuses. So here was the thing from Monday. I'm going to clear this out, except for the submit button. And actually, one other thing I'm going to do, well, let's make some pretty commits, since I haven't been demonstrating pretty commits at all. Okay, so I cleared out stuff we're not going to use. Cleared out form elements from Monday. And I'm going to add an ID of submit to my submit button so that I can refer to it easily. So I'll make that a separate commit. Like that. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to make this form, I'm going to think about this form as something that might get stuck in a column or in a header or in a footer someplace that will allow somebody to sign up for a fictitious newsletter, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong, in fact, there's a lot right, with if you're working on developing a feature for a site, do that development away from the rest of the site so that you can really focus on the element that you're building and try to get it right to begin with. So, let's see. Get our newsletter, right? There's some attractive, human-friendly copy. And we can say something like, and notice I'm doing this all inside of the form element. This is completely legit and allowed in HTML. Sign up to receive latest news and breaking alerts right in your inbox, right? Because that's what everybody wants, is one more thing in their inbox. Okay? So what do we want to ask from users signing up for our newsletter? Their email. Is there an input type that we can use to get their email? Say it louder. Yes. Input type email. We'll call this name email. We'll give it an ID of email. And let's just close that for now. And of course, we want to use a label. What should we use for our label? Yeah. Right? What's that called when we do something boring like that? Remember what this acronym is? PULS. Principle. Say it louder. TK, you had it. I heard it. Principle of least surprise. Right? You were close. Okay. Principle of least surprise. If you're asking for somebody's email, just email. Right? Everyone is going to understand what that is. So we go with it. Now, here's something that I love to do when I build forms and really mean what I'm doing. I love to use the ordered list. Right? Because forms are generally, I mean, there's an order to them, right? Generally. I mean, I suppose if you're asking lots and lots of things, whether you ask somebody's age before their address or something, that probably doesn't matter so much. But we can still think of forms as being a step-by-step kind of thing, right? What do you get on your little keyboard when you're filling out a complex form on your phone? Apple users get something like this. This is above the keyboard area. You might have a little button that says Next. And when you tap that, it takes you to the next form field, so you don't have to screw around sliding your finger up and then reactivating a form field. This will just take you to the next active thing. This works the same as what on a physical keyboard? Not the enter key. What does the enter key usually do on a form? Okay, it is the tab. But let's talk about what does the enter key do if you've got a form active. It submits it, right? But on a physical keyboard, the tab key generally will take you between fields. Sometimes you have to work a little hard against your browser and its default settings for that to happen, but generally that's the expected behavior. So I think an argument can be made for using the ordered list to surround our labels and inputs. Why is this a good idea? Why not put label in its own list item and the input in its own list item? Why would we stick those two together in one list item? Say it louder.
You want that to be together.
And why do you want it to be together, Rosa? What are we doing in HTML always? Nice word, starts with S, Rhymes with emantics. Semantics, right? We're semantically saying this is a item in a list of things, right? This is some item in our form. Here's its label, and here's the actual input where you can enter the data that we're asking. So this is nice. This also gives us something that we wouldn't have otherwise, which is a nice semantic element that we can style, right? If we wanted to move these things around or do something fun with the label or some other things that I'll show you in a bit, we've now got a little piece of syntactic sugar, right, to manipulate this thing as we want to. In fact, we can do something like add an ID of email input. I think I like that okay. I might refine that further, but for right now, that works. So now I have a way to uniquely reference this list item. All right? And even though it's just a lowly submit button, we'll go ahead and do the same thing for it. Tuck it inside of a list item. Close out our ordered list. And let's add an ID onto here just in case we want it. Submit input. You know what? I'm going to switch these. Input email, input submit. Why is it advantageous? And here I'm thinking in terms of CSS selectors to do prefixes like that on an ID. What can we do with prefixed, if you're assuming you're consistent, what can we do with prefixed ID values like that? Yes. Aaron is talking about attribute selectors, right? So in CSS, we can do something like li, and then we open up our attribute selector, and then we can do ID, and then let's look at the reference because I'm going to screw up the character, and I don't want to screw this up. Let's see. Attribute selectors. There we go. Always nice to see MDN beating out W3 schools without us having to ask for it. Okay, so we have just the plain old attribute in brackets. That will select any element that has the attribute. So if we say li ID and just close it without that equal sign, it will select all of the list items that have an ID assigned to them. Here we can find out an attribute which has the exact value of value, right? This one with the tilde in front of it, right? Do we all know that that's what that little squiggle is called, is the tilde? This is an element, an attribute name of attribute whose value is a white space separated list of words, which is way more firepower than we need. Okay? This is the one we're after here. Represents an element with an attribute name of attribute whose first value is prefixed by value. So if we do ID equals, is it equal? God, I'm having a hard time keeping it together here. Caret equals input, like that, then we can select all of our list items that have an ID attribute that begins with input. Okay? We could do it the other way, right? There should be an operator here for where it ends. Yeah, there's our $sign. But this makes for a more legible code. We can quickly scan and see if something begins with input. So that's why I'm doing those things there. All right, this looks like a decent time for a commit. Added additional HTML semantics to a form asking for an email address. All right, push that thing up. Now, without having done anything much in our CSS or JavaScript, let's have a look at this thing and talk a little bit about progressively enhancing these forms. So if I fire up HTTP server here, localhost 8080, all right, and here, yay, the old style form. Let's blow this thing up a little bit. Now, how do you activate the area where you're going to enter data into a form? Not a trick question. Yes? You click it, right? And usually you click right on the element itself. Boom. Expected behavior, principle of least surprise. Little known fun fact. If you click on the label for an element, and watch it not work. Come on, you're supposed to work. Oh, why is it not working? What crucial piece of information did I leave off of my label? Yes. See, when semantics suffer, we all suffer. Label for email. Let's reload it. All right, blow it up again so you can see it. Now if I tap on email, that activates the form element, right? What's our magic number for a tappable area in pixels? 44. Thank you. Right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have a 44 pixel tall or wide input. We can also think about a sloppy finger can tap that label area. And something else that's nice, let's see if I did this in the CSS for Monday. I think I did because the label's up there. Yes, I told the label to display as block. What happens by default? How wide is something when we say display as block? Louder? Yes, or the width of the containing element, right? Get the full width of that. So that means if we just drop in some, I'll just do it on label here so we can see label. If we do background color or just background red, if I reload this page, this whole stripe in here now will activate that form element. That's awesome, right? That's nice touch-based design. That's stuff that if we had dropped a break tag into the HTML to get label on its own line, you would have a clickable label, but it would only be that actual text area of the email, right? Okay. So let's do our due diligence here and get some base styles for this whole page here. Let's open up our HTML selector. And just for the heck of it, let's go and pick ourselves a modular scale since we haven't looked at that. No, I'm questioning my, there it is, yeah. All right, so I don't know, what do we want? Let's do a perfect, let's do a major third today. Okay, so we can use this modular scale to choose our text sizing up and down, right? So I'm thinking, show me this in pixels. Let's go with our old friend 18 pixels here. All right. And maybe this form is going to be a call out, so we'll go a little bit bigger. Now, I am going to write only in pixel values during the demo for the lecture today. I promise tonight I will go back and rewrite everything in M's, but just for the sake of being able to focus more on our task rather than doing M conversions all over the place. So here, to do, convert all px units to M. So I'm going to say font size, 22.5 pixels. Right? That'll be my base font size. Let me go back and look at my page. Drop this thing down. Okay. I think my get our newsletter text might benefit from being a little bit larger. So we can go up, let's say, let's make it obnoxious. We'll go up to 35.156 pixels, just like that. Right, so H1, font size, 35.156. I should probably make a note to myself. Major third, modular scale. What was our ratio on that again? 4:5. All right. So if I save that, now I've got my larger heading 1. Boom. Now we've got our get our newsletter. So what line height should we set here? Right? I'm going to do a baseline grid. Even with a form element, we can still have a nice baseline grid. What size should we specify for a line height? What's our typical one? How many %? 120. Good. So that's a 27. I'm going to bump that up to 28, make this nice and touch-friendly. 28 pixel line height. All right? And of course, H1 is going to be squished because the font size that we've set on H1 is bigger than 28. So why don't we bump this thing up a line? Now let's do 2 lines. We'll make it real big and obnoxious. Nice and touch-friendly. Line height, 56 pixels. Okay? And just for the sake of our testing and development and sanity, let's drop in base hold it. Remember that? What's base hold it do? Yes, shows the grid lines for our baseline grid. So we'll say media screen, href, basehold.it slash, and then we just give it in pixels what our baseline grid is, in this case 28. Okay. Happy double line spacing for our heading 1. Happy line heights on our paragraph and on our label. And then all kinds of terrible things start to happen below that, right? Our input is too small. Our submit button has got a line through it, right? We would expect at least a line for each of those things, right? Because we have to think about this. What ultimately goes here is some text, right? So there's no reason that we can't keep the same kind of predictable reason up. Difference is that we've got to make some choices about how these elements get displayed. Okay. And if we were to look at this, we would see these submit buttons are different places. So one of the things that I like to do, at least as a starting point, I don't necessarily always ship projects with this, but Normalize.css is sort of like the evil twin of reset CSS. Rather than doing what a reset does, which is to get rid of all margin, get rid of all padding, get rid of all positioning for subscripts and superscripts, and unify the font size and the line heights and things like that. What Normalize.css wants to do is basically give all browsers the same exact base set of styles. Now, if you use a Normalize.css file, or you end up in a job where you're forced to use a Normalize.css file, you're back in the same position on most elements as you are if you're just designing back against the browser without a reset, which is to say that if it opens up with, like this one does, let's look at just what is there. Right, if we just use this thing, their HTML is set up with a font family set to just the generic sans serif. It has a line height of 1.15. Where is that value coming from? There's a little note by it. We can look at that. Correct the line height in all browsers, right? That's a pretty tight line height. We'd expect at least 1.2. But again, what this Normalize is trying to do is basically do what most browsers do and then set it explicitly in the text there. All right? And there's our text size adjust, which we end up using in our own sheets. That's fine. Here we're removing some margin. Here we're doing the same thing we do after our resets, which is to give display blocked all our newfangled HTML things. Let's go down further to their forms area. Okay? And here we've got a note for 1, which is that these are opinionated changes. So what do? They set all form elements to have the font family as sans serif, the font size as 100%, the line height as 1.15 again, and then no margins on anything. All right? See what they're doing with button and input. They're doing overflow visible. Why are they doing that? Show the overflow in Edge, right? If you look at a normalized CSS file, Internet Explorer /Edge will be mentioned more than anybody else because, again, it's Internet Explorer, it's Edge. It has to do things just a little bit differently, okay? All right. Remove inheritance of text transform in Edge, Firefox, and IE. Okay, so all of these are doing some kind of text transformation. Oh, good. Here, Apple haters. Here's a WebKit bug that destroys native audio and video controls in Android 4. How weird is that? That's actually a Chrome thing, okay? And we want to correct the inability to style clickable types in iOS and Safari. These are the kinds of things when you see we want to correct the inability to style clickable types. That's a really useful style, right? Because generally we like to style everything. So this allows us to do that by using a vendor prefixed WebKit appearance button. Okay. Then we're removing the inner border and padding in Firefox on its buttons, on type of button. We get rid of, or you make uniform the focus ring, right? What's the focus ring? Can we see the focus ring in action? Boom, that's what it is. It's that little halo, that little fuzzy gray border around here. That's the focus ring, right? So this will at least make that uniform if we drop that in. All right. Here we're doing some normalization on field sets, which we won't talk about today or probably very much. Do the same thing for legend, for progress. We get rid of I can't tell you how many nights of sleep I lost over this back in the day with IE. When you use a text area, what is the text area for in a form? What kind of input does it allow you to do? Yeah, or well, not multiple words. You can do multiple words in an input, multiple lines of text, right? Most form elements that you interact with, like to post to Twitter or Facebook or whatever, those are text areas that allow you to do a multi-line input. IE will always have a scroll bar on the bottom of, and sometimes on the side as well of a text area, even though the text area was sized to fit the viewport and didn't have any crazy overlapping content in it. If we set the overflow property to auto on IE, that will correct that particular bug. All right. All right, here we're doing some box sizing. What are the two primary box sizing values that we can set? What's the default on most modern browsers for box sizing? Do you remember this from last semester? Well, we can see one is called border box. What's the other one called? Starts with C, rhymes with ontent, content. Such a bright group in here. Content box. What is the difference in these two different modes of sizing? If I say a border box sized element is 100 pixels wide and has 50 pixels of padding, that's actually a kind of a bad example. That will do very strange things. Let's just say 10 pixels of padding. How wide is the element as it displays on your screen, sized as a border box? Maybe you'll get the answer correct over here. If I have content box, which is the default sizing, 100 pixels wide, 10 pixels of padding, how wide will the content box be? Yes, say it louder. 120. In the content box model, right, whatever your content is, that box is going to be at least that big relative to the content. Any padding that you add, any border that you add, increases the overall size of the box, right? So it keeps expanding out from whatever you set as the width on the content. Border box, by contrast, says the very edge of this box, the width of this thing is going to be 100 pixels. Any border or padding that you add to that is just going to subtract from the amount of area that the content occupies, which is why I get rid of that original 50 pixels, because, of course, if you say it's 100 pixels wide and you give it 50 pixels of padding, it will completely squeeze the content, and it will probably do weird things like fall into a straight line down below or something like that. But here, we could say this is still going to be 100 pixels wide, and how much room is there for content? 80, right? All right, and as we're going to see very shortly, this is a useful kind of sizing to do for all of our inputs, especially if we're doing mobile-first responsive design. Okay? So always to keep those two box models in mind. Here we're doing border box sizing on checkboxes and radios. We probably won't talk about today because we're going to just stick with the one thing. All right. Correct the cursor style of increment and decrement buttons. That's great. Appearance in Chrome and Safari of the search. Okay, so we're going to give this WebKit appearance text field. Okay, right? By default on WebKit browsers, they do something funky with search fields. Like if you do type search, you'll get this little egg-shaped thing, and you have the little magnifying glass, which doesn't make any sense, right? Why would a search box have a magnifying glass? Like, I tend to think of search as like an expansive. I want a telescope, not a magnifier. Like magnifier, I think I was up close. I don't know. Whatever. This gets rid of it, sets the default, and here we have an offline outline offset, which is good to know. All right. Here we're going to remove inner padding and cancel buttons in Chrome and Safari on Mac OS. So we're going to just get rid of these extra buttons. Oop. All right. Here's more inability to style clickable types. Those are on our file upload buttons. If you come and take my Rails class this summer, we'll be dealing a lot with file upload stuff. It's a tricky business, and styling these things can be some of the worst problems that you face. All right? And that's it for the forms. Okay? Clearly, you've all memorized everything I just said. No, why did I go through all that stuff? What behavior am I trying to model for you? Besides obsession with detail. Right? I'm going to drop this into my project now. We never want to do something silly like just grab some random CSS because we think it's going to solve our problems and make our lives better, right? We want to look through and do an audit. Every single line, what's it doing? So that we can then make informed decisions either to replace what it's doing or at least even just study it to know what the selectors might be that we have to call on. For right now, I'm going to drop this thing into my CSS file. And I'm going to do it right up top after my form elements. And I'm not going to minimize this or minify this, at least for right now, the way I did my form styles. This is the heartbreak of those inline. Oh, no, that's OK. And Normalize.css form styles. Let's go up here. Where do they begin? Not quite there, not quite there. Here we go. Begin Normalize.css form styles. All right, and let's be good caretakers of source code, and let's put in the actual reference to where we got this. There we go. I'm just going to grab the first part of this URL, just pointing to the GitHub repository. Boom. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And let's just pull open our form as it sits right now and reload it and see what happens. Okay. If you blink, you'll miss it. Our button now has a more consistent style that is not as dependent on the operating system styling. We've also now got a problem of our text area box being too big, right? Before it was too small. Oh, come on, give me my lines back. There we go. All right. And this is off. I don't know if you can see the Y on my grid line here. That's too close. So I don't trust that this thing is sitting properly on the grid line. And there's good reason for that. But let's go ahead now and write our own. Well, let's do some commits. All right, first one, 0130. Let's add that. Whoop. Oh, that's right. Git add index.html. So this commit added missing for attribute. All right. And what do we got left on what's left? All right. So now I've got an ugly mix of things here that make me sad. But I'm going to just make one giant commit here. Added Normalize.css form styles. Added base typographic styles for page. Okay, shame on me for doing that, but just do this quickly. Okay, so that's pushed up there. So now, I want to set to the task of getting this thing corrected. And the first thing I notice about this input area is that it has a border on it of some kind. Right? So I'm going to try to get rid of that. So if I go back to my CSS, let's go back down here. Okay, here's my form stuff. So I'm going to try to single this thing out. Input, type, email, right? So this is very targeted. What happens if I just set border to 0? Here I'm going to basically write some reset CSS for myself. If I set border to 0 on email, what happens? Ah, it goes away. All right? And if I click on email, no border. Okay? Is that a good thing, Jingwen? Boy, why is that not a good thing now? Right? We've made the thing invisible. Right? If we get rid of our base, hold it here for a second. Oh, it's a good way to do this. Just drop a hash in front of it, right? Then it's looking for a URL fragment, not an actual thing. Yeah. Clear out our. Right? There's no indication at all that there's a form there. So we're going to want to do something with that. But in the meantime, if I'm just after trying to get my typographic scale, this is useful information to have here. Okay? So we know we're not done. All right? I'm going to do some other things to my CSS here. All right? In fact, I'm going to put this in my label and form areas. I'm going to say font family inherit, which is my expected behavior, right? If I set a font size or font family on the page, please just inherit that. Font size, let's also inherit that. And line height, let's also inherit that. Okay, so what happens now if I reload this page? There we go. And of course, I'm having problems with base hold. It doesn't want to load. Show me my lines. Oh, slow internet. Okay, while it's getting itself together, I keep typing u@form.com. How can we have it so that there's some input there that it gives an example of what people might enter? Placeholder. Oh, good, there's my lines. See, if you threaten it to go do something else, it loads your item for you. So on our email here, we can do something like, we'll stick this at the very end, placeholder. And we can do u@example.com. Anybody know anything about example.com? This is such a great piece of trivia. If you go to example.com, you get this message. This is an example domain. This domain is established to be used for illustrative purposes in examples and documents, right? You may use this domain in examples without prior coordination or asking for permission. So we're going to use example.com. This is way better if you're showing example data to people, if you're writing a book or an article or something like that. Don't make something up like u@homepage.com and then you go to homepage.com and it redirects you to some like heinous porn site or something like that. If you use, I swear that happened to me on an article, like I got emails from people, you're directing people to a porn site. I'm like, it was just example data, right? So I learned my lesson real hard. Use example.com, right? Because that's actually what this is for. All right, so if we do that, including in our email address here, right? It's still a dummy email address, but we give an indication of the form that we want people to enter their data in, which of course is the standardized form for an email address. So if we reload this page, there we go, delete that. So now there's our u@example.com. All right. So now we've got some fairly good confidence that this is sitting correctly on the baseline. All right? Okay. So let's go about making some more stylistic changes here to our baseline grid. So I'm going to go and find my paragraph. And I'm going to say padding bottom, 28 pixels. So I want to drop a whole line of space after my paragraph. Oh, the slow connection is going to kill me today. There we go. Okay, so there's my little email address has been moved down by a whole grid line, which of course isn't showing because why would that possibly work for me? And just out of sheer morbid curiosity, I'm going to add this border 0 to my submit button as well. And I'm going to do that by pulling it out of this specific input type email. And the other thing I'm going to do here real quick is drop in margin 0 and padding 0, okay, which we've seen on reset CSS. Oh, come on. There we go. Ooh, look at that. Look how nice and pretty. I mean, it's ugly. You would not want to use this form, but in terms of stripping back this submit button to it's nothing but text and a little bit of background color, and now it's sitting perfectly on the grid line, right? So we can do some more fun things here. We can go and say, ooh, let's get a little bit more space here. We're going to go to our modular styles here, right? So far I've been just using regular elements, but I want to go to my modular styles. I'm going to say form. If you encounter list item elements in your midst, let's drop a line of space. Actually, I'm going to do margin on these guys. Margin bottom, drop another grid line of space in there. All right, so if I do that, now I've got another grid line that separates my input element from my submit button, just like that. And the other thing I want to do, though, let's see, inputs. All right, so I'm going to add to these things, right? Because ideally, I'd like to be able to click out here and activate this column, particularly at mobile first scales, right? This thing ends kind of in an arbitrary place if we do a background shocking red here. Where are our clickable areas? Okay, we have this sad little place where there's just a no man's land for activation. If somebody has a long email address, they won't be able to utilize that space. So let's do the responsive thing that we do with images. Just make the thing 100% of the page, all right? And we'll do that by changing our box sizing to what? Which one do we want? Let's do content box just to see how that's the wrong choice. Okay? Box sizing content box will say width 100%. Okay? We'll do that. And if I reload this page, boom, that looks pretty good. Yay. Must be that content box is the right answer until we say, well, you know, let's give some room for this thing to breathe. We actually want to do, we've got a 28 pixel line height, so let's drop in 14 pixels of padding so we get a half grid line top and bottom that adds a full grid line on here. And of course, that will add 14 pixels of padding onto the left and right, which sounds like a darn good idea until we do this. Oh, come on. And now we've got this. Why is this happening? Horizontal scroll will be the death of all of us. It's doing that because we set the box sizing to the content box. So when we say width is 100%, by God, the width of that thing will be 100% plus however much padding. So the current width of our inputs is 100% plus 28 pixels, which means that no matter how big or small we size this viewport, there's always going to be a horizontal scroll there. Okay? So let's change this around. Do what we should have done originally box sizing, border box. Now if I reload this, there we go. Now our submit, hello fans of centered text, submit is nice and centered there, and there's no horizontal scroll bar. And if IIT's network resolution could get its act together, we might get our grid lines on this thing too. There we go, right? So again, we've got 2 grid lines now for the label, which we would expect, okay, given its line height and given how big we set the padding to be. Not that you can see that at all. Let me set, instead of this shocking red, let's have shocking yellow. Okay, now you can see the grid lines on that. So now we're lining up all of our form elements on a baseline grid. You will have to search far and wide to find many sites that do this kind of thing. Most developers, most front-end developers, front-end designers certainly are just terrified of form elements, which is why they look like garbage everywhere, right? Where's my favorite site to make fun of and say what everything is wrong with the world? my.iit.edu. Right? I love to talk about this page because this is everything that's wrong with everything, right? And of course, it doesn't want to load, right? What's the one area of the page that you actually care about here? The login. And what's the smallest landmass on here? Right? The login. If you want to, like, if you can't afford a dartboard at your house, just print out this page and then make that the bullseye there, right? Because it's so small. And then you have this dinky little box here. Like, it's so dinky. Do you want to type in that? Is it fun? No. It's cramped. And you see this on other sites. Like, enter your credit card information. Then they get this tiny little box. Right? This has an effect on you as a user. Right? You're probably immune to it by now because most forums are so abusive towards people that you don't even think about it. Right? But if you're spending much time with this, that gets to be a real pain real quick. Right? It might not be so bad if you just have to enter username and password. If you're entering billing address and shipping address and all of these things, that becomes a much bigger issue. Okay? So we want to give this thing some room to breathe. And when we do this, where am I? Right? Now our user is typing in this nice big space. Now we haven't done anything interesting here. I wish I actually owned Stolly.com. 1994, I could have bought it and didn't, and here we go. All right? But we've got this nice open space. Right? We might need to do some more to make it clear that this thing is an activable area. All right? But let's talk now about JavaScript and front-end stuff and how we can, without doing much more design stuff, right? We're going to talk about typography next week. We'll talk about color the week after. But since some of you have been talking on Basecamp about using JavaScript in your forms, let's talk about it. Okay? What's the problem with this form? And again, try to imagine that this is not the whole page. This is at the top of a sidebar or in the footer for somebody who made it that far. What is the unnecessary thing on this form? If you're not going to use this form, if you don't care, what's the unnecessary thing? Well, but let's pretend there's content after the bottom half of the page. What's pushing that content down that nobody cares about? The submit button, right? The submit button is completely useless and stupid unless somebody has entered some data and wants to submit it, okay? So let's do some things to get rid of that submit button unless someone has committed to adding an email address to the page, okay? What was that attribute that we used for phone numbers the other day? Remember this? There was another P attribute. It started with the letter P. Pattern. Right? And for our phone number, we wanted a pattern that was just what? We did 0 through 9 and then star. Right? Which just meant if there are 0 or more numbers in this column, right, that's what you can expect. That has the side effect in iOS, in Safari, and I think in Android of forcing a number keypad, right? You don't get the punctuation marks and all the other crazy stuff. All you can do is enter digits here. Okay? Here we're going to use pattern because we're going to actually refer to this thing in JavaScript, and what we want to do is find a pattern that will match an email address. Okay? If you are not thinking clearly, which of course is most of us most of the time, we might do something like regex pattern email. And with any luck, this will land us right at, okay, there's regular expressions.info. Usually there's a good Stack Overflow. Okay, here's a good, this one, right? Using a regular expression to validate an email address. Okay. Over the years, I've slowly developed a regular expression that validates most, in all capitals, email addresses correctly, assuming they don't have an IP address as the server part, right? Which, of course, if that's the case for somebody's email address, your form has failed. All right? So I was hoping that some people would have some examples. Okay, if you really wanted to use a regex, here it is. Right? This is crazy town. There is one, and I don't care what anybody else ever tells you, there is one true and holy way to validate whether an email address is correct or not. What is the way to do it? It's not a regular expression. What do you do to validate an email address?
Send it an email?
Yeah, you send it an email. That is the only way to ensure that an email address is valid, right? You can write a crazy regular expression like this, and it's good until the moment it's not, and it disallows somebody from submitting their email address because they've got a new, @photography or @photography domain or something like that, right? This is always a moving target. So when I'm writing an email address, regular expression, or doing any kind of JavaScript for doing data validation, I have one rule for it. I'm trying to help the user. I am not doing security, right? JavaScript is not a good way to enforce security, because what do you do if you know anything about hacking a site? You disable JavaScript. You write your own grease monkey script. You open up the console and just start writing your own things. So JavaScript is not a security feature. You're not going to be the last line of defense of a site. You're there just to help users. Okay? We also don't want to enforce particular rules on data, right? Some clever developer is going to be like, well, what we really need to do is make sure that telephone numbers only have 10 digits in them, right? Because we can count them. We have an area code and an exchange, and then the actual, I forget what this part of the number is actually called, right? 10. But what if somebody wants to add 1, right? Or what if somebody's international and they want to use a 2-digit or a 3-digit country code, right? If your form obstinately sits there and says 10 numbers, that's it, then we run into all kinds of problems with these things, right? Which leads to then what's the next response that people will do? To impose their will on the form and the user data that can be entered. If your site requires a first and a last name, what do you do to people? Well, you do this. Which means that Cher and Bono and Sia can never sign up for your service, right? Because they've just got one name, right? You see this all the time. This is obnoxious. What's that? Well, and then we get, then it spirals out of control. We get middle initial, then we get prefix, and we get suffix, and all that. Be kind to your users. Okay? You're not the IRS. Name. Right? That's all that matters. We just need the name. If you're processing credit cards, we might say name as it appears on card. Right? Which might have, Roman numeral 3 for somebody the third, or it might have junior, or it might have a middle initial or something like that. If we just give people one area to enter this information, then on the back end we can do all kinds of crazy stuff. We can say, hey, split this name at the first space Everything that comes before the first space is their first name. Everything that comes after the second space is their last name. If there's 2 spaces, then the middle thing is their middle name. Right? And then what? What happens if you get it wrong? If you've written this beautiful thing, so we just let people write their name, like they've been doing literally since kindergarten. Right? The teacher doesn't say, write your first name in this box and your last name in this, or maybe they do if they use Blackboard, I don't know. Blackboard in kindergarten? Right? People are used to writing their names, so we let them do this. So let's say we write some piece of data processing on the back end that splits their name at spaces, and we get it wrong. What do we do, Rosa? How do we correct it? Say it louder. Well, we might go with autocorrect, but I'm thinking like, you know, if somebody, I'm trying to think of a name. Usually I can think of celebrity names that fit these patterns. Here's an author, David Foster Wallace. Right? We could process this name on the back end, and in the case of his name, we could accurately say first, middle, last. Right? This is a fairly standard Western country first, last, middle name. Right? Why can't I think of another name where this would be? Let's pretend that he goes by David Foster. Right? Let's say we got this wrong, and he goes by David Foster. His last name is Wallace. How can we correct that if our database has split it incorrectly? And he expects when he gets automated emails from us, dear David, he wants dear David Foster. What can we do as developers? Give the user the option to fix it, right? The sign-up form, the initial thing where we just want their name, make it simple. And then we can have edit profile. And then, because we've already got our clause in this person, then we can give them the separate boxes for first and middle and last and suffix and all of that stuff, right? Not everything is always a line of code. Sometimes you want to just be able to give people the option to make a correction to something, especially if it's a correction to something your algorithm did. Okay. So, what is the guaranteed always to work in terms of how an email address should be formed? What is that regular expression? It is not 20 lines long. We should have a dot, which means what? What's a dot in a regular expression? Say it louder, you're really close. No, I'm talking about in a regular expression. On the command line, that means right here. In regular expressions, what does a dot mean?
Every character.
Yeah, any character, right? So we need one or more, right? That's what the plus sign means. One or more of some character. Followed by what? I thought I heard it over here. Let's make a fake email address. We need one character. You have to have one character for an email address to exist. You can't just have @example.com. Right? So what do you need after one character? @ Right? And then what do you need? You need at least one other character over here. Now it says tat on the board. Okay. Now we expect things like, example.com. But if we start over-determining this, right? We say, oh, there has to be this many characters, or oh, there has to be that, right? You'll see tons of regular expressions for checking emails that look for dot and then 3 characters. Because in the old days when somebody wrote that regular expression, you had .net, .com, and .org, and that was it. That was before you had .co. That was before you had what is the British one? .co.uk and things like that. So that's why we don't want to write regular expressions. Because, of course, now we have .photography. Like there's even a .beer top-level domain. So we don't want to worry about that. All we want to do with our regular expression is say, is it reasonable that somebody is entering an email address here? If we check for these things, some character, one or more of them, followed by an @ sign, followed by one or more of some other character, that's probably an email address. Is it a valid email address? Don't know. How are we going to find out? Send them an email, right? As soon as they sign up, hey, welcome, thanks for signing up for our newsletter. Or if it bounces, then you have some other options to do. Usually it's just a lost cause because the person is not going to come back and be able to check the status on their subscription or something. But they might try again later if they care enough. Why is this a dumb pattern? Email. Re-enter email. Has anyone here ever, honest to God, typed your email address twice? What do? Yeah, you copy it from the first box and paste it into the second box so that the form buggers off, as the British would say, right? This is a silly pattern. This is a waste of time and space. This has helped nobody, right? Oh, thank God they had that re-enter thing. I almost entered my email the wrong way, right? Because what else? Let's say you are somebody who will type your email address twice. What does this invite if you've got somebody to write their address twice?
Another chance to misspell it?
Yeah, maybe they screw it up the second time around. Or maybe they're not as careful because they know that they'll have a second shot at it. If we just say, what's your email address, then maybe that invites a little bit more careful entry. And maybe it's a little bit less friction, right? If you have one form that has one input and one form that has two inputs, which do you as a good, lazy citizen of the planet want to fill out? One with one form element, right? We want to reduce the friction of doing this stuff. If we start asking for a whole bunch of other stuff, if in the sign-up we said, hey, what's your name? How did you hear about our site? What's your household income, right? We start stacking up all of these invasive, nosy questions, or even if they're not invasive, right? Like, the more things that you're asking for somebody, every single step of that is an invitation not to actually go and follow through on the form, all right? So, how do we write this regular expression? We have a dot, and an @ and a dot, and another plus like that. And if we want to, we can add in some additional operators. Let's see, let's get a good JavaScript. Regex, reference, okay, here's our structure. We have a pattern. We have flags. Okay, I think by default we're ignoring case, but we might want to put that in while we're doing any characters, so case is not going to be an issue. Okay, so we can look at these character classes. There's our dot, right? Matches any single character except line terminators, right? So no new line characters, which might be helpful against preventing some mischief. Here we've got word characters, we've got space characters, all right? We've got character sets. Ooh, this is what I was looking for. Okay, this is a negated character set. There's another use for these meaning of these characters though. Here, this character matches beginning of input, right? So if the multi-line flag is set true. Okay, so if we want to, we can make this a little bit more persnickety. We could say beginning of input and then a $, end of input, like that. Okay, I'm running out of time. Went way too long on that stuff over there. All right. So let's look at how this actually works in JavaScript. So here is my standard thing that I love to do in JavaScript, which is I will remove that Node.js class and then add this has.js class. That allows me to do some very fun things, like I can say, here, let's go down to our state styles. I can say, if you have JS, if you has JS, all right, find input type submit, and let's do position absolute and left minus 10,000, I feel really big today, 100,000 pixels to the left, negative, okay? What will this have the effect of visually? it pulls our submit button out of the document flow and then yanks it 100,000 pixels off the left side of our screen. It will not force a scroll bar. All right? So it has the effect of hiding. Submit button is gone now. Okay? Now, we did not just say, hey, find all the submit buttons on this page and hide them. We said if somebody has JavaScript available, then hide this button. Because the assumption is we're going to use JavaScript to put it back. All right? So let's do this in 11 minutes. So I want to, in my JavaScript, and we're going to start talking about more sophisticated ways so we're not just stacking up stuff inside of the ready event, but for today we'll do that. So I want to listen on my input, right, my email input. When this pattern matches, I want to show the submit button. Okay? Because then we think somebody's committed. They're not just writing "you suck" in the form or something like that. They have to write at least "you at suck," and then we'll give them a submit button. All right? So I'm going to listen on, where are we? ID email, which is our input, on, and now I want to check this thing. I need to check it every time somebody types. Right? Because when they first type that first letter, that's not going to be an email address. They've got to type at least 3 letters. Right? Let's look at our event reference. There's key press. Let's see if we can get up from here. Okay. So a lot of people who don't know what they're doing will use the key press event. Key press event is fired when a key is pressed down, and that key normally produces a character value. All right? Which is nice, but if we go back up to our event references, there's a better event that we want to listen for. Just search for key in here. Here we go. Key down, key press. Okay, so this is any key except shift function caps lock is pressed in position. Here we've got key up. Any key is released. That's actually the point we want to listen for, right? I'll let you go home and play with your keyboard and see at what point does the character appear on screen. At what point would we want to check for the data? It's usually when somebody has released that key. So we'll listen for on key up. So on key up. And let's just close this out so we're ready to go with this little method call. All right, on key up. Let's just, for today, run an anonymous function. Okay, and I'm going to create some variables. Var, current value, and var, valid pattern. Okay, first one here is going to be for my current value, so I can use the special handy-dandy jQuery this. So we're listening on email, so we want the value of this, which we get through, we don't have time to look at the documentation and stroke our chins, but we're going to say this value. Find the value of email. On every time that key comes up, listen for it. Find out what the value is of that thing. And then let's mark our valid pattern, which will be this. Then we'll use the attribute selector in jQuery, and we're listening for pattern. Okay? That will grab our regular expression. We could rewrite this in JavaScript very easily. We can say, here's the valid pattern, but this allows us to be dry. We can put that pattern right in the HTML where any kind of script or any kind of anything would want to access it. Here we're just pulling it out of the JavaScript. And so now I want to say if current value match valid pattern, do I have enough parentheses? I don't. Okay. If that matches, then we're going to find ID submit, which is our submit button, and we're going to add a class of active. All right? Which means we need to go real quick to our CSS, and right below this thing, we'll go the full route here. We'll say if you have JS, your input is type submit, and your class, not has.js, is active. So we're saying, notice no space there. I'm saying if this class of active is on this input type submit. This is valid CSS, but that lack of a space is important. If you put a space there, it will look for an active class of something inside of ID submit, which you'll never have because an input is a void element. Okay? So if you're active, then we're going to just do the default thing that we expect. Position static, which is what we get before we have this line where we're saying position absolute. We don't have to worry about setting left back to 0 or anything, because if something is positioned statically, the left property in CSS has no effect on it. Okay? Graceful, elegant, very little code. From an accessibility standpoint, you might be saying, why couldn't we just use display none? Right? You could do that. You could say has.js input type submit display none. Then down here we can say display block. The problem is, if you use display none, if somebody is using a screen reader that reads the page to them, that display none will also hide that input from somebody who's on a screen reader. Under certain circumstances, they might not be able to interact with the form appropriately. If we say this thing is positioned absolutely someplace out over the middle of Nebraska, then sighted people won't see that, but people who are having the page read aloud, the screen reader doesn't care how far over the middle of the country you've put this thing, right? So this keeps it accessible, and then boom, we say position static. Let's do a little bit of diagnostics here because I've got 5 minutes left, and the possibility that I introduced an error here is almost certain. I'm going to say console log current value and valid pattern. Okay? Which means that once I go back to my form, every time I type, the console should log what I've typed so far. Okay? So we can at least see if we're getting that. So let's see. If current value matches valid pattern, add class active, that looks right, that looks right. Okay, let's try it. Then we can figure out what I forgot. All right. Okay, so, ooh, and I need my JavaScript console up so we can see what's happening. You see this showing up in the console? So my function that's listening for that key up event is doing the right thing. Now it's tacking on the pattern right after that, because what I wrote, okay, it heard that. There's our submit button. I'm glad Jing Wen is smiling. She's with me, right? Now, if we get rid of our valid email address, the submit button stays there. It does not go away, which might or might not be preferred behavior. If we want it to go away, that's why the gods gave us the else. Submit, remove class, active. Okay? So if suddenly we're not matching the pattern anymore, then let's just hide that submit button. Okay? And now it's just stuck. Let's do it. Okay. There's our submit button. Back it up. No longer valid. We have submit. Now, all I've done in the JavaScript, and this is an important point, I was really hoping to write some fancier panted CSS, but we'll have to go with regular boring pants CSS. All we've done in the JavaScript is to add and remove a class. All right? And right now it's doing very old school 1998 CSS where we show it or we hide it. Using the presence or absence of this class and CSS transforms, we can do all kinds of fancy animation things. We can have that button fade up from nothingness. We can have it slide down from beneath the submit button. We can have it do cartwheels onto the screen or something like that, right? This is as much as we want JavaScript to do. We don't in JavaScript want to tell it like to over a millisecond or 1,000 milliseconds or something, gradually bring this thing on the screen. We're just going to drop these classes in, and where we'll head next, and we've got a whole week on Motion where we'll really focus on that. We'll drop this thing in. Now, one more thing, because I've got 2 minutes. We can end up in some weird conditions here, right? If for some reason someone has started entering their email address and the page gets reloaded, we get this weird condition here, right? You add it, right? That matches our pattern. We should see a submit button, but Agvila, why is there no submit button there?
I don't
Yeah.
I know
Well, what event are we listening for?
the person typing. So they
Yes, key up, and they haven't typed, but they might have their thing in there. So what we need to do is add to this list of events. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, don't only listen on key up, listen if they focus the element, and listen if they blur the element, meaning if they go someplace else. Listen for that thing. So now, just adding those 2 additional events along with key up, if I reload this page, hopefully that'll stick. And of course, it's going to make me look like a fool. Focus, blur. I know that's correct. Oh, wait, no, that's correct. Focus and blur. Oh, we need to listen for another event. Okay, so if they go back to this, then they'll get it. Right now it's showing up because I'm focusing on that. It's going to check again if I go on blur. I need another event that's going to listen when the page loads. I'll add that tonight. Okay, so while I'm standing here so I don't forget, let's just commit what we did. Okay. This is going to be a sloppy commit. I'm going to go home and I'm going to break this up. I'm not going to commit it. So you can just go home. All right? Later tonight, I'll clean up my commits so they make a little more sense. All right? Have a good weekend. We'll see you next week. We're going to talk about typography and these things. Thank you so much.